Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is Excavating Depth, the podcast where we get to the heart of things that matter with empathy, vulnerability, and compassion. I'm your host, Megan Reimer. Welcome to episode 4. We're trucking along on these podcasts. And I've got a great topic for us today. I will just say I have been receiving some amazing feedback from this podcast. So thank you. I'm glad that these stories are resonating with you. Not every podcast will resonate with every listener, and that's okay. But again, the intention is to find some point of connection and help us feel a little bit less alone as we navigate the world through ups and downs and turns and dives and stops and starts and all of these things that make life life. Thank you. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your comments. It makes me want to keep recording. I'm sure I have no shortage of things to talk about. Today, I want to dive into identity death. You've heard of identity theft. That is not what I'm talking about. I want to talk about identity deaths. The reason I want to talk about it is because I think I have a few friends on the cusp of it right now. I just talked to a friend of mine the other day who mentioned feeling that way about their career. And it's a really important thing to navigate and to get out into the open, especially because I think there's so much centered focus on one group of people who experience one kind of identity death, a midlife crisis, right? We hear about midlife crises all the time. I think back to movies I watched as a teenager. It was always the 40-year-old dad or the mid-40s dad who's having a midlife crisis. He gets a divorce. He starts working out. He gets a new job. He gets a sports car. He starts dating a younger woman. And it's as if we have said that only men in this space who have been married, who have kids, who are around this age are allowed to experience these renewals of life, and therefore no one else is allowed to. But we all experience them. There are 3 in particular in my life that I think about, that I've been present to. We experience identity deaths even when we don't know it. And I think it's often in our adult years, especially as we're navigating careers or we're moving cities or we're stepping into parenthood or we're stepping up into empty nesting or we're getting married or getting a divorce. But I think it happens all the time to all of us at any age, even at a young age where we haven't even really formed an identity yet. I was 6 when my parents got divorced, and I think there was a bit of an identity death even in that, and that I'm no longer the child in a happy family where my parents are together. That is an identity, to be a kid in a nuclear family, and there is an identity that is attached to kids whose parents are still together and kids whose parents are not still together. And when your parents split up, you sort of step into this like kid of divorced parents. And that's a whole other persona in a sense. And your life goes down a different path than it would had your parents stayed together. My parents needed to get a divorce. My parents weren't happy. And staying together for my brother and me was not the right choice. But that changes you. I can even imagine the identity death of being a wife or a husband in a family and now being a single person and seeing your kids only so often and stepping out of that. So I guess that was kind of the first time I experienced identity death, although I had no idea what was happening. The first time I was much more present to was when I was about 18. And so backing up, when I was about 12 years old, my mom and my stepdad got married, and I had a tradition, typically, or a typical summer routine, where after school ended, I would fly out to Winnipeg and visit my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, at their cabin in Manitoba for a few weeks or a month, and then I would go to northwestern Ontario and visit my maternal family, my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and cousins. That was pretty typical. And I would come back home mid-August and spend the last couple of weeks at home and then go back to school. My mom and my stepdad got married in early July, and that changed my routine for that summer in 2002 because all of my family came from out east to Calgary for the wedding. And so the cousins that I spent the most time with in the summer came out to me. And I kind of remember that the deal was if I wanted to spend time out east with them for the summer, that I would have to drive back with them instead of flying there in like a month. So I agreed to do that. There was one scheduling challenge, and that was that my cousins go to Bible camp every summer, and it's for a week in July. And usually I go to visit them in August, so they've already gone to camp. But by driving home with them, I would be there while they were going to camp. So my options were go to camp with them or stay at home by myself while all of them went to camp, including my aunt and uncle because they volunteered and cooked at the camp, and stay home alone at their house by myself in a very small town. And so I was not religious, I was not a Christian, but I thought I want to spend time with my cousins, so sure, I'll go to camp. I've never been to any kind of summer camp before, Bible or otherwise. I'd been to like day camps, but never to an overnight camp, so I had no experience of that. And I was 12, I was just like, I just want to hang out with my cousins, so sure, I'll go to this camp thing, whatever it is. And I came out of that camp as a Christian. It was a really fun camp, and people were really nice to me. I was not being treated very well at school. I was bullied a lot. I was an outcast. I tried really hard to be friends with popular kids. And I was kind of on like the outskirts of their friend group. And I was sort of starting to gain weight. And I was just bullied a ton at school and felt really lost and lonely. And when everyone at that camp was so nice to me, I was kind of like, I mean, if this is what it means to be a Christian, that I'm not getting bullied and that I can have fun, and then I'm willing to try this out. So I became a Christian and came home. That was a bit of an identity death to go from sort of being on the outskirts of my quote unquote friend group to stepping into this new identity of being a teenage Christian. And it took me a while, but I found some friends that I would stay friends with until graduation. And I just felt so connected and like I belonged. And I was not a super devout religious person. I think largely because my family, my parents weren't religious. It was really like self-motivated. And when high school ended, I started to feel some separation and started asking myself a lot of questions of if this was what I wanted and this was what I really believed. I think it got me through those last 4 or 5 years of school with a solid group of friends. We didn't get into trouble. When I graduated high school, I stayed close with some of those friends. I started working for WestJet and met some new friends at WestJet. And I kind of started feeling, I imagine pulling dough apart, just like this slow um, distancing from who I had been. And I mean, 18, when you graduate high school, you really are stepping into a new identity. And I didn't go to college right after high school. I took a year off. A few friends moved away to go to university. So our friend group became a bit dissipated. And I do remember truly reflecting and saying, like, I don't know that this is for me. I don't know that I want to continue down this road. I don't know that I believe this religion or have this spirituality anymore. I was navigating a lot that was telling me that this wasn't for me. And when religion is what kind of holds you and your friends together, uh, and you're not religious anymore, then you sort of lose your most common grounding point of connection. And it's safe to say by, a year and a half to 2 years after high school, I really wasn't friends with 90% of the people that I had been friends with all, for the last 5 years. And I found new friends through WestJet, people I'm still friends with today. Almost 20 years later. But that was a real transition for me, both stepping into Christianity as a young kid and stepping out of it as a young adult. It was a very labeling experience. To be a Christian, it's a very strong label and it's very defining about, in theory, the kind of person that you are or will be and what you believe, of course. And stepped out of that identity and very quickly into a new one that I didn't know I was stepping into. And that was being a WestJetter. And I wouldn't really know what that meant for probably 2 or 3 years into my career there. Kind of when I started working at the airport, it was a little bit more evident to me. But at 18, working in the call center, I just didn't understand where WestJet sat in the industry in Canada. I didn't understand what a potent brand it was until probably I started working at the airport and then moved to head office. And of course, it's even more evident at head office. I remember thinking at one point, like, people who work for WestJet are just like this special group of people who just have a kind heart and are funny and are sweet and are easy to be around and are kind. And like, it was very rare to find somebody who worked at WestJet who was a dick. There were some people, and I did find them. They were mean, but it was pretty rare. And yeah, this WestJetter identity really, really clung to it. And people knew me for it. My family was proud that I was a WestJetter and would share it at every opportunity. And that too, being a WestJetter is a very labeling experience. Just like being a Christian means something, being a WestJetter means something to people who know, right? Like people, mostly Canadians, right? You know what that means. And it became really evident to me, ironically, just like 6 months before I got laid off, I started my master's degree at Royal Roads, and it was a predominantly online degree and in my cohort were people from all over the country, literally coast to coast. We had people from Victoria and we had people from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland in our program. And in one of our first classes, we were asked to, we had like an online discussion board. The prof asked us to introduce ourselves using 5 words, just 5 words. His example was like dad, professor, things that are pretty descriptive. And my first word was WestJetter. And I remember thinking, that's probably all I need to say. That's enough to tell my cohort of people who live all across the country the kind of person that I am. And under the WestJetter label was kindness, caring, friendly, funny, clever, creative, smart. All of these other identifiers fell under this label that I didn't have to figure out. I could just say WestJetter and people would be like, I know what that means. Like, I'm immediately attracted or connected to you because I know what that means. And it's also interesting because kind of around that time, I remember WestJet was a very unique place to work. And I remember when I started in 2006, they had been in business for 10 years at that point. And they called the finance department Beanland, like counting beans, counting money. And we called it the people department or people resources instead of human resources, like all of these kind of unique little things that made the organization a little bit different. And because I started there when I was so young, I didn't actually know that these things were different from other organizations. I'd worked a couple of jobs before that, but they were customer service jobs like Future Shop and Extreme Pita, and so I had no idea about the finance space of that. I was just, making a pita or selling a cable or whatever, right? And so I had no idea that these kinds of things were unique to WestJet. I think when I was applying for my degree even, so even in like 2018, 2019, I felt things were so unique to WestJet that I didn't know how to explain them to people outside of the organization. I didn't even know how to really explain my role to people outside of the organization. I didn't even really know that my role existed outside of the organization. When I did my bachelor's degree, I did the first few years of it in person at Mount Royal in Calgary. And then I took a few years off and then when I started working full-time 9 to 5 at WestJet's head office, I realized I wanted to get into corporate communications. And so I started an online program to finish my degree and do communications. And I'd already kind of been doing it for a period of time. And I remember one of my classes, I had to do a communications plan. And I was like, I think I do this every day. Is that this? My prof is like, yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. Like I had no idea that all of the things that existed at WestJet existed outside of WestJet. Or I thought that because we had funny, unique names like Beanland, that whatever we called things was different from what everybody else called them. So that's why I was like, a communications plan, is that this? Is that a WestJet term or a generic term? But I think I really had a hard time figuring out what, like my transferable skills were and how to describe my role to people outside of the organization, or that role existed. And when I applied for my master's degree, you have to submit a letter of interest and a resume. And especially as an older student, you have to prove that you have been doing work that's relevant to this degree. Living in the WestJet bubble was kind of hard. It was very nurturing and easy to exist in, but because I had existed in it since I was so young, I grew up there and just grew up with it, in a sense. I kind of liken it to this. So I am bilingual, and I started in French immersion in grade 1. And from grades 1 to 9, all of our classes were in French, except for English. And in junior high, we had, like drama or computer class. That was in English. But the core subjects, science, social studies, math, French, were in French. So I learned all of these scientific and mathematic and political and social, like all of these terms, I knew them in French. I never needed to know what they were in English. And in grade 10, some of those subjects were taught in English, grades 10, 11, and 12. And science was one of the topics that was now being taught in English. And I vividly remember sitting in our grade 10 science class, and there were like 4 or 5 of us from the same junior high school sitting together. And the teacher is spewing stuff in English, and we had no idea what he was talking about. Like, there we are, we're like 15, and we know science, but we don't know all of these terms. And we would have to figure out the term, acknowledge it in French, and then learn it in English at 15. And that's sort of how it felt leaving the WestJet bubble. All I knew was French. I only ever learned these words in French. I never learned what an organism was or a cell. I just did not learn those words in English. I only learned them in French. And there wasn't any support for like, hey, here's a list of all the words you learned in French immersion, and here's what the words are in English, so that you can succeed at this. It was just figure it out. And that was kind of how it felt, being outside of the WestJet bubble. I didn't know that job titles were the same, or typical, hierarchical structures were the same, or departments were the same, or kind of any of this stuff. So when I started at Royal Roads, and our prof asked us to introduce ourselves using 5 words. My first word was WestJetter. I don't remember what the other 4 words were, but I truly felt like WestJetter was enough. I didn't need 4 more words, actually. I just needed the one. And I really felt that anybody reading that would know exactly what kind of person I was, because there are these kind of umbrella terms, right? It's like, oh, if you're a WestJetter, you must be caring. You must be friendly. You must be fun. You must be funny. You must be smart. You must be clever. You must be all of these things, right? Because that's just who Canadians know WestJetters to be. And I thought nothing of it at the time that I posted it. But I do kind of remember thinking, like, it's kind of all-encompassing. I don't have to define myself in any other way. And so the first, month and a half of our program was online. And then about a month and a half in, we went to Victoria for a 3-week residency. And, now we're meeting all the people that we had been chatting with online in person. And I remember sitting in the cafeteria over lunch one day, and someone came up to me and said, like, hey, I really have been so excited to meet you, because I wanted to ask you about something. And I was like, my gosh, okay. He says, when we were asked to introduce ourselves using 5 words, the word you said first was WestJetter. And I was so curious about why you did that. And he's like, I know WestJet and I know the culture, and most Canadians are familiar with the WestJet culture. And I don't know, I don't remember, I don't know that we actually got to have the conversation, but I do kind of remember thinking, like, I mean, if I say that, what else is there to say? I don't have to figure out who I am otherwise. I can just say WestJetter and people know what that means. I don't have to define myself in any other way. I don't have to know who I am in any other way because that's like the core of me, and that core shows up in every other situation, in every other relationship. It shows up at school, it shows up in family, it shows up at the grocery store when I'm interacting with the checkout clerk or wherever, right? Like it just shows up because I believe that like WestJet had made me that person versus I was that person already, and WestJet brought it out or nurtured it in a sense because I was surrounded by other people who were like me, and I was encouraged to be myself. I remember when I first started working there, and there was a bit, they're kind of like MO around hiring people was we hire for personality and train for skill. Right? So like you don't know how to use this computer system or board a plane or whatever, like we'll teach you as long as your personality fits within our culture. And I really didn't feel like I had to define myself in any other way. And 6 months later, COVID hit, and half of the people who worked there were put on leaves of absence. And 4 months later, I was told I wouldn't be going back, that I was laid off permanently. Yeah, enter identity death. I found out I wouldn't be going back in July of 2020, but technically my employment didn't end until November. And, we had been out of the office working from home for 4 months. People who were still working were working from home. And uh, the transition to working from home was very abrupt. It was like, today is Monday, starting tomorrow, everybody's working from home. So bring your computer and what you need home tonight because we have to start working from home right away. And so I just brought what I needed home, but I actually had a lot of stuff at the office that was mine. And so when I knew I wasn't going to be going, I would not be returning, I was allowed to go into the office and collect my stuff. And I remember posting to my social media, including LinkedIn, that I had taken a picture when I arrived at the campus and posted, "This is the last time that I'm walking in as a WestJetter." And I remember so many people saying to me, like, "You'll always be a WestJetter. You're," people still say this to me today, like, "You're a legend. But you'll always be a WestJetter, no matter what." And, I mentioned in a previous episode that the reason I moved out of my condo, part of the reason was because I was seeing planes landing and taking off every day in front of me from my condo, and that was causing me a lot of trauma. And like at the time, I was really mad. I was really mad because the company that I had given so much to laid me off in like a 2-minute Teams call. I got no follow-up. I got nothing from anybody for the next 4 months until I was handed a severance package. And I was mad. I was really mad, pissed, and sad. And like nobody looked at my name on a list of possible people to let go and said, "Megan Reimer, no, 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 no. We can't let her go." Nobody did. And I felt ditched, abandoned, like not fought for. And so I was really pissed at WestJet. And when people said to me, "You'll always be a WestJetter," I was like, I don't want to be. I actually don't want to be. I don't want to be tied. I want to cut the cord because I'm pissed. I don't want to be part of this. Even my choice of severance package, because I had a choice to take flight benefits for a certain period of time. I kind of remember thinking there was a part of that it's like, I don't want to be connected to this company anymore. And certainly leaving and starting to work for a new company and stepping into a contractor role and then selling my condo and moving, all of that I felt the identity death, like I truly felt it. And I felt very conflicted because I was really mad. And people who were saying it'll always be a Westjetter was like, fuck that. I don't want to be. I don't want to always be a Westjetter. And the other part of me was like, oh, thank God. I want to stay connected to this for as long as I can because I don't know who I am if I'm not a Westjetter. I genuinely don't even know how to define myself if I don't define myself first as a Westjetter. Like learning scientific terms in English for the first time after only knowing them in French for 10 years. I don't know the words. I don't know how to describe myself to someone asking. I don't know that I'm kind or smart or empathetic or friendly. I don't know these words because I used to just be able to say Westjetter and people knew. They just knew what that meant. It was just inherent. The kinds of people who work for Westjet are these kinds of people, therefore you must be this kind of person. I didn't have to describe it. They didn't have to describe it. We just knew. It was just this mutual understanding. I did a lot of personal development coaching during that time, and I remember talking to my coach about this identity death. I think she was the one who helped define that term for me, actually, because she too had experienced that, having gone from her previous career to now stepping into being a coach, which was very different from her previous career. And I remember I know that I have a journal somewhere. I probably still have it that says, if I'm not a Westjetter, who am I? And I think that was part of that coaching work, was like homework almost, was like, you gotta, write this out, figure it out. And not that we're like amazing at, defining ourselves anyway, or being like, I'm so compassionate, I'm so empathetic. If you want to know who I am, most of the time, who we are is demonstrated through how we are and how we behave. But I really needed to just figure out who I was outside of label these well-known labeled identities that I had had for almost 20 years at that point, being a Christian and then being a Westjetter, and I didn't have to know anything else. And truthfully, the personality characteristics were fairly similar. But yeah, I really had to figure out, like, if I'm not a Westjetter, who am I? Not just what am I, not just how do I show up, but literally who am I? That was my first real presence of an identity death. And it was really a struggle. It was a huge struggle. And I imagine that a lot of people come out of a career change and think, who am I? And maybe not everybody has that experience of like, I don't even know what are people who work for Air Canada called, right? Like, not a lot of companies have a term for their employees like that. That's so tied to the company name, Westjetter. It's very defining, but there aren't a ton of companies that do that. I can't think off the top of my head, like someone like a McDonald's, sir, or like a McDonald. I don't know. Like I honestly can't think of any other companies who name their employees something like that. Like a fan club, like being a believer. I just said that, or like that's the only one I can think of. That's what it feels like. And but I imagine that people still step out of careers and think, I've been a project manager, I've been a nutritionist, I've been a teacher, I've been a whatever for 20 years. Who am I if I am not this person? If I am not in this career? And when I stepped into being a contracted employee, on one of my contracts, for the first couple of years that I was a contracted employee, my mom kind of kept asking, oh, is this going to lead to a permanent job? And I was like, I don't want it to. I like being a contracted employee. And a big part of the reason I liked it was because I had this separation of church and state. I had this separation from the company emotionally because I was not a company-er. I was just an employee, just a contractor even. And so I didn't feel like personally connected when the company was in the news or when we were doing something new, or, I could close my laptop at 5 o'clock and turn my phone off and walk away. And And I didn't want that again, probably largely because I didn't want to attach myself to an identity again that I might lose. I really never thought that I would leave WestJet involuntarily and so early. I could retire with flight benefits in 2027. It's only 2 years from now at 39. And that was kind of the plan. I mean, really, I didn't know what the plan was because I knew nothing outside of WestJet. I didn't know that there was more. So I didn't even really have a plan, but this was certainly not it. I felt safe there. I was a good employee. I was well known. I was well respected. I felt safe. And I kind of remember as I was starting to navigate the contract world, my first contract after leaving WestJet lasted just 6 weeks. And then I got released from it early, aka fired. And then I was like scrambling to find another job again, another contract. And I did sort of have this uncertainty of like, I don't know if I want to do this, if this is going to be so, like, if I can't feel secure in this. Like when I was employee, I felt really secure. And I think it was my brother who said, like, did you? Because you got laid off. I was like, yeah, good point. I guess I wasn't as safe as I thought I was. And now I just like create my own safety, I guess. I haven't really thought about that, but I guess that is what I'm doing, is just creating my own safety now. That was the first real presence of an identity death. And I think I have a few friends that are kind of going through that right now. And it is fucking terrifying, especially if you don't kind of have something else to like ground you as to who you are. You're so, if it takes up so much of your time and so much of your energy, which it often does, it seems to just go hand in hand. This like strong sense of identity with everything you pour your energy into. And so, yeah, when you no longer have that thing to pour your energy into, of course, the question is going to be, well, where do I put my energy? Who am I? If I don't put my energy into that thing, where do I put my energy? And therefore, who am I? And I think we get unintentionally stuck in these identities that and we don't see how there can be space for something else, that there can be something more. My third identity death, or my next kind of big one, was moving to BC. That came with an actual identity change in terms of a new driver's license and new healthcare. And like, I am no longer an Albertan. I'm a British Columbian. The first week I moved here, I changed everything over. I think you can live in another province for 3 months or something before you have to change, but I did it as soon as I could because I wanted to step into this new identity. I was so eager to just be like all in and committed. I'm everything kind of quintessential about being a British Columbian now. I'm a fucking hippie and I live in the woods and all this shit. So I'm kind of quintessential, but this wasn't me 3 years ago. So that was even an identity death, to move out of Alberta and to move here. And I mean, this is an identity I'm fucking embracing, and that feels aligning, but it was still tough. I lived in Alberta since I was 2. That's huge too, right? To move and to embrace a new way of living, moving from a small town to a big city, or a big city to a small town. That changes who you are. And you either kind of fit in and align or you don't. You find out it's not for you. So I'm a 37-year-old single woman with no kids. And I've had like at least 3 midlife crises. And I'm not an atypical, mid-40s husband, dad having a midlife crisis of buying a sports car. But here I am. And we all go through this. I think one that is kind of talked about is becoming a parent, right? Or getting married, and like you're leaving your single life behind, you're leaving your kidless life behind and stepping into something new. And there's always like the core of you that partakes in every identity, things still change. I would imagine like when your kids move out of the house and you become empty nesters, that's also a big identity death. And I mean, so many things can cause this. And I think ultimately what it's doing is like leading us to true alignment. So, and I want to make sure is like really clear in these podcasts is that even though I have made these huge changes, you don't need to make huge changes to experience these feelings, because it's not so much about like the physical experience of what happens so much as it is about the emotional experience that happens. That's where the relatability comes in. The connection comes in here. It's not like, oh, you moved to BC, you moved to a tiny remote island from a big city in Alberta. So did I, right? Like, who are you going to find who's done that? But this, like, taking this leap, stepping into something unknown, willingly ending something that is good and stepping into something different that is more aligned but is scary can happen in so many different ways. It doesn't have to be, I quit my job, right? Or like, I left my husband, or we moved to a new city, or I lost a bunch of weight, or, it doesn't have to be this like pivotal thing, outward experience to feel the inner experience, even though there are some big examples for me. I don't think that it takes a big example to feel this identity death, or to feel any of these other feelings. And that's what I want us to understand, is that we are connected because we feel the same, not because we have the same lives or we experience the same things. We're connected because we feel the same things. Yeah. Getting to the heart of this. It is our inner experiences that connect us, our inner emotions, feeling of stepping out or being pushed out of something before you're ready, or before you wanted to, or even if you are wanting to, but it's good, or you're doing it because you know it's shitty, or it's shitty and it's still happening to you when you didn't want it to happen. You hate your job, but you get laid off, and it's like, well, fuck, wasn't expecting that. It's, yeah, these like inner experiences, the courage to step into something new or step out of something, whether voluntarily or not, by the way. Where do we put our energy now? What else needs us? Where can we go? What can we do now that we get to step a little bit more into who we are? So that's kind of what I hope to create connection through, is like the inner experience. The inner experience of an identity death for me was like, who am I? Who am I now? How do people know me? How do people see me now? If someone asked me now to describe myself in 5 words, they would be really different. But that doesn't mean it was wrong. I want to make that really clear too. That doesn't mean it was the wrong path for me, or that it was a bad path. I mean, I grew up at that company. Most of my friends whom I talk to on a regular basis today, I met through WestJet. They are my best friends. It doesn't mean it was wrong at all. It just means it had to end. And even as I'm navigating life right now and finding ways to be more creative with my energy, including starting this podcast and seeing if there are ways I can expand my business. There are parts of me that think that maybe even my identity is not in like being a corporate specialist or change management specialist, right? Like, so many people go from corporate jobs to being like a coach. And that's brilliant. And I'm like, maybe, but like, I have 2 degrees in this, and this is what I've been doing for the last 10 years. And, like, that's scary to think about letting go of all of that. Like, as if all of this work and money and energy spent was a waste. That, like, even now, I'm like, I don't see another identity. I don't see another career path. I don't see doing a complete 180. I don't even know what. Doing something that has nothing to do with organizations or communications, or like that. It feels terrifying, But even if that were to happen, not all of this would be a waste. For some reason, I can't stop thinking about the TV show The Office. You know, Steve Carell left in season 7 before the show was done. And I listened to a lot of podcasts about that show, and like by all accounts, everything was great with the show. He still loved it and still loved the character and still loved his castmates and the crew and everything like that. He just felt it was time to step into something new. And I just saw a clip recently from a podcast that I haven't listened to fully yet, but it was Rainn Wilson, who plays Dwight on that show, saying he was actually incredibly depressed and anxious on the set of The Office, even though it was like the best time of his life. That's how I felt at WestJet. Like reflecting back on it, you know, like there were times I was incredibly depressed and incredibly anxious, and it was directly tied to work, by the way, but that was not enough for me to be like, maybe I should leave. Because the identity is comforting, right? And the misery is comforting versus the discomfort of something new and the discomfort of the transition. It keeps us stuck because we will go through an identity death. We just don't know it. To my loves who are on the cusp of that, you are so much more than your career identity, and so much more is possible. And you may already be experiencing what more is possible. You may not be. So you may be having to put some blind trust in something that more is possible. And that's scary, but it's brave. And it's brave to look at something and say, as deeply connected as I am to this, as much as it is me, as much as I am it, it is no longer serving me, it's no longer making me happy, and I have to step out of it. Fuck, that is so courageous. We can't all do that. So many of us would rather stay stuck and stay in that. And, you know, I could be real cliche and say life is too short, but that's not really the point. The point is not like that life's too short. The point is like, fight for yourself. I was so pissed that nobody at WestJet fought for me. And now I get to just fight for myself. Now I don't have to rely on someone else to fight for me. And that's deeply terrifying and like a huge burden. And like the weight of my world is on my shoulders, and like I just want to pass it off to someone else. Be like, someone come rescue me. Someone come fight for me. It feels so good. And yet feels so shitty when no one shows up. But that's what I've had to do these last few years, is just fight for myself, because there was nothing else to fight for. And no one else was going to do it for me. You know, as miserable as I was at that house in Cochrane, no one else was going to make a move for me. They didn't have a spouse or a partner to say, okay, we're moving. I'm dragging you with me. It was all me. I had to fight for myself. I had to fight for my own happiness, my own identity, for my own soul, because I didn't do that before. At WestJet, I relied on someone to do that for me. And you know, now people describe me in ways I don't totally resonate with, like brave and a fighter and independent and courageous. And I don't know if those were words I would use to describe myself if I was given that chance to say, you know, describe yourself in 5 words. But I look at other people going through the same inner experience that I am, and sometimes the outer experience is similar, and I think, holy fuck, that person is so brave and so courageous. Getting to the heart of this, identity deaths are a part of us. They're a part of life for all of us, whether we want it to happen or not, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, whether we see it or not, whether we're present to it or not. It's kind of always happening. And we're often like scrambling to find who we are. And it's kind of like we're always searching for something through external labels, probably because we don't know how to define ourselves by who we are, or it's braggy or not humble. We look for humble things, what we enjoy instead of who we are, what we are instead of who we are. WestJetter was really what I was. It was not who I was, because I am still who I was at that time, even though I am no longer a WestJetter. I am still that kind, caring, compassionate, empathetic, funny person That's who I am. A dog mom is what I am. A marine life lover is what I am, but it's not really who I am. I think maybe that's at the heart of this. I think a lot of these things we're identifying as actually what we are and not who we are. Being a corporate communications specialist says nothing. I could be a really good writer but still be a prick, It says nothing about who I am. And so I wonder if even in that sense we aren't really having identity deaths because who we are fundamentally really isn't changing. I mean, we evolve, we do change who we are. I was certainly a different person, I think, at 20 than I am now at 37. But I also think a lot of the core elements of my being were the same, just like they were when I was 6 and 12 and 18. I had all of these core characteristics. Being a Christian was what I was, but caring and loving people is who I am, who I was. That was just an avenue for it. I mean, I think we can change who we are if we really want to, but that requires getting pretty deep and pretty vulnerable and doing a lot of healing and a lot of self-reflection. But I think about it now, literally in this moment, and it's like identity death is just shedding what I was at that time. And as much as I thought it was telling me who I was, it never was. So, getting to the heart of this. These identities are just what you are. These identities are just a label. I think so often the world asks us what we are. The question is worded, who are you? But the answer that people want to hear is, what are you? Because who are you is actually a really deep answer. And we're not ready for that yet. It goes back to asking how you are. We're not really ready to hear, I'm depressed today. We're really just ready to hear, good, how are you? We're not ready to hear the true answer to the question, who are you? Because that's deeper. What are you, though? Well, that's easy. It's like being asked to, introduce yourself in a meeting or a classroom. Like, tell us a little bit about who you are. And it's really, tell us a little bit about what you are. So I identify it this way, that who you are is your core. And what you are is just a WestJetter, a teacher, a tea lover, a brunette. I think what you are can change. I think who you are really is who you are. You can certainly be, there's certainly space for change, always. But who you are is pretty elemental, pretty core. And I think maybe what's important to know is that through these identity deaths, when you're shedding what you are still who you are. And there's security in that. I am still who I am. If I don't have this space in which to be who I am, I can find another space to share my gifts, to share who I am, to be who I am. The what I am is just the space provided to you to share, but the who you are is what you're sharing. And really, we can do that in any space. It's just got to be safe. Who I am. Who I am is love. Who I am is empathy. Who I am is vulnerability. Who I am is kindness. Who I am is joyful. Who I am is funny. And what I am is the space for me to be that person. And not every space will allow us to be that person. And I think that's the real struggle. I remember one point at WestJet when I had a new boss I didn't get along with, and I was really struggling in my role. I think I said this to a friend, is like, I used to be, this boss really wanted me to do certain things differently than the way I was used to, and different than kind of the culture at WestJet was used to. And I think I kind of remember saying something like, I can't even just be who I am anymore. It just gets shut down. Even at the place that helped me figure out who I am. That's what WestJet did for me, was help me figure out who I am. But it was no longer actually safe for me to express that and be that person. My boss didn't want me telling little jokes. It was unprofessional. I was like, I don't have an outlet for this anymore. And I think that's really what caused that depression. It's like, I don't get to be who I am anymore at the thing I spend all my time at. It's got to be what causes us depression and anxiety, in a sense, is not getting to be who we are, being restricted from being that, and being worried that we won't be loved if we are. I mean, that's what's at the root of my anxiety, is if I am who I am, are people going to love me? If I'm a little bit insecure and I text them 80 times in a row, are they still gonna love me? If I make a dumb joke and they don't find it funny, are they still gonna love me? If I move away to be where I need to be, are they still gonna love me? And depression is like I can't find that space to be that person. I think part of this podcast is giving myself space to be that person, because I have been experiencing some depression lately, and this is a creative avenue to be who I am. And there's anxiety attached to it. Will people love me? Will people listen? Will people connect with me? Will people want more? Or will people shy away from me or think, oh, she's getting too vulnerable, too icky? But this podcast is not who I am. A podcaster is what I am. It's just allowing me to be who I am somewhere, because I don't have a ton of other outlets right now. Getting to the heart of this, I think I've said that 3 or 4 times already, but getting to the heart of this, these identity deaths that we are having, the more I think and reflect on them, the more they are defining what we are. We are a kid in a nuclear family with 2 parents. We are a Christian who has a good group of friends and doesn't get bullied. We are a WestJetter who's encouraged to be themselves. We are hippie islanders, but through all of those identities, I have still been who I am. I've still been loving, still been empathetic, still been deeply emotional, still been kind. And I think those identities dying just lets us see who we are more. Just another layer falling off. You've seen those entertainers who like change dresses or change outfits every few seconds, and if you know the inner workings of that, they're just like layers of clothing that they're wearing that they're literally taking off. And that's what I feel like this is, right? You're just removing layers until you get to who you are and get to the space that who you are becomes the label. There's no other like label for me right now that encompasses who I am, right? WestJetter was the label. I didn't have to define it. Christian was the label. I didn't have to define it. And that's only true for me, not true for all Christians. So please, if you are a Christian, don't take that anyway. I can't even think of like this umbrella term that I would use for myself right now that encompasses everything the way those terms did. And that's kind of fucking freeing. I get to just be who I am instead of this what now. And it allows me to evolve, but it allows me to ebb and flow a little bit and be more free. As much as it was an umbrella, it was also a bubble. And now the bubble is burst. Yeah, like I can't think of any one word, you know? And I kind of fucking love that. I love that I can't think of a word because I'm so much more than just one word. We all are. So fuck the one word. Because who you are, if you are not, enter word here, is so much more. Whether you are that word or not, whether you are doing that thing or not, who you are is underneath that. This is just a labeled death. My dog is snoring and twitching next to me, which might be as good of a sign as ever to end this podcast episode. Thank you for joining me as we navigate identity and who we are. I hope that if you are navigating a space of shedding an identity, that this has been helpful and active. Let me know. I love, love, love hearing from you. And thank you for listening and for creating this safe space, and for loving me as I do it, loving me as I be who I am and share it.